The silence that descended upon Brentwood on the night of December 14th was unlike anything the historic neighborhood had ever experienced. For decades, the Reiner name was synonymous with the very soul of Hollywood, a lineage of laughter, intellect, and what many described as a profound American decency. But as the holiday lights twinkled against the cold California air, a single phone call shattered the carefully maintained peace of one of the industry's most respected dynasties. It was a moment where the private agony of a family finally collided with a public reality so dark it seemed to defy the very legacy the Reiners had built. Rob Reiner and his wife Michael were more than just a power couple. They were the anchors for their children, especially for their eldest son, Jake, who had spent a lifetime navigating the delicate balance between his own ambitions and the heavy gravity of his family's internal struggles. Jake had always been the steady one, the observer, the son who chose the grounded path of journalism to carve out a life away from the blinding glare of his father's fame. Yet, despite his efforts to build a wall between his professional life and the growing chaos at home, the truth finally broke through. Today, we are peeling back the layers of a story that goes far beyond the shocking headlines. This is not just a report on a tragedy. It is an investigation into the warnings that were whispered in private before they were echoed in a courtroom. It is the story of a brother's love pushed to its absolute breaking point and the unbearable weight of a son who saw the storm coming but could not convince those he loved to seek shelter. As we look into the life and courage of Jake Reiner, we uncover a truth that no one expected, a warning issued 3 months too early and a final, agonizing choice to let the music stop. To understand the man who issued such a chilling warning, one must look at the foundation upon which he was built. Jake Reiner, born in May 1991, entered a world defined by the monumental legacy of the Reiner dynasty, a lineage where creativity and civic duty were the family's true currency. He was the third generation of comedy royalty, the grandson of the legendary Carl Reiner and the eldest son of Rob Reiner and Michael Singer. In the Reiner household, the dinner table was not just for meals. It was a masterclass in storytelling and political activism, shaped by figures like Norman Lear and the constant pursuit of the best version of Hollywood. Growing up in Los Angeles, Jake quickly learned the weight of his surname. While his father, Rob, had famously struggled to step out of Carl's shadow at one point, even joking about changing his name to Carl just to be like him, Jake took a different approach. As the eldest of 3 siblings, he adopted the role of the steady observer, while his brother Nick, born 2 years later, drew the room's energy with a more fragile and volatile spirit. Jake became the anchor. He was the child who accommodated, the one who learned to stay quiet so that the focus could remain on his younger brother's increasingly complex needs, instead of immediately chasing the Hollywood spotlight. Jake pivoted toward the world of facts and hard news. He moved to Syracuse University to study broadcast journalism, a choice that allowed him to define himself by his own merit rather than his heritage. His career began in the trenches of local news, moving from Keene and Salinas to Parch 2 in Houston, where he worked from 2016 to 2018. In Houston, He was not Rob Reiner's son. He was a professional respected by the Houston police officers union for his fairness and integrity. However, being the responsible son in a family facing a brewing storm meant carrying a dual life. While Jake was reporting on the tragedies of others at legacies in Los Angeles, he was quietly witnessing a tragedy unfolding within his own family. He saw his parents, Rob and Michelle, pour their unconditional hope into Nick, who had entered rehab 18 times by the age of 23. Jake watched as his father tried to bridge the gap with Nick through cinema, directing the film Being Charlie, a project co-written by Nick that mirrored his own struggles with addiction and the pressure of a famous father. For Jake, this period was an exercise in endurance. He saw the decency his father championed in public being tested by the reality of a son who did not bond a lot with him as a child, and who was increasingly drifting into a darkness that love alone could not illuminate. As the eldest, Jake felt the impending fracture long before it happened, setting the stage for the warning that would eventually haunt his every waking hour. As the paths of the two Reiner brothers diverged, the contrast became impossible to ignore, painting a picture of two very different lives unfolding under the same legendary name. While Jake was establishing himself as a formidable voice in the world of hard news, his brother Nick was locked in a grueling, decade-long battle with heroin addiction that had seen him enter rehabilitation facilities at least 18 times by his early 20s. This divergence was not just about their career choices. It was about the fundamental way each brother interacted with the family's legacy of unconditional hope. Jake's journey was one of meticulous, self-made progress after building a reputation for integrity in Houston and later at legacies in Los Angeles. He made the courageous decision in 2023 to transition from journalism to his true passion of acting. This was not a move fueled by nepotism, but by a refined talent that had been simmering beneath the surface for years. By 2024, Jake's commitment was validated when he starred in the independent film Love and Tax Dollar, earning the Best Actor in a Comedy Award at the Myrtle Beach International Film Festival. It was a moment of profound personal triumph, a sign that the steady son had finally found his own spotlight. In stark contrast, Nick's life was defined by cycles of homelessness and recovery. He lived on the streets of Maine, New Jersey, and Texas, later admitting that he felt like a dice roll every night he survived. In 2015, the family attempted to bridge these two worlds through art. Rob Reiner directed Being Charlie, a film co-written by Nick that was loosely based on his real-life struggles with addiction and the strained relationship with his father. Rob later confessed that during those years, he and Michelle had been desperate, often listening to rehab counselors with diplomas on their walls instead of listening to the raw, painful truth their son was trying to tell them. The film was intended to be a father-son redemption story, an act of public hope that the worst was over. But for Jake, watching from the sidelines, the vaguely optimistic resolution of the movie did not match the reality he saw at home. While the world saw a family healing through cinema, Jake saw the underlying instability that the script had elided. This period marked a critical shift for the eldest brother. As Nick's demons became more pronounced, Jake's role transformed from a supportive sibling to a terrified observer who realized that the decency his parents relied on might not be enough to hold the family together. While the Reiner family portrayed an image of healing to the world, the reality behind the closed doors of their Brentwood estate was far more precarious. Jake Reiner, ever the observant journalist, began to see fractures that his parents' boundless optimism simply refused to acknowledge. By 2019, the Los Angeles Police Department had already begun responding to welfare and mental health calls at the residence, hinting at a domestic environment that was becoming increasingly unstable. For Jake, the 3 months leading up to the tragedy in late 2025 were defined by a desperate, almost frantic effort to establish boundaries. Reports from those close to the family suggest that Jake had reached out to Rob and Michael with a clear and urgent plea that the family's current approach to Nick was no longer sustainable or safe. He had witnessed the long simmering tension and the emotional turmoil that had been building for years, and he feared that the cycle of enabling was reaching a catastrophic flashpoint. The conflict was one of fundamental philosophy. Rob and Michael, described as loving, devoted parents, operated from a place of unconditional hope, believing that one more intervention or one more show of support would finally lead Nick to stability. Jake, however, was operating from a place of survival-based fear. He saw Nick not just as a brother in need of help, but as a person whose deep-seated struggles, potentially including unmanaged mental illness like schizophrenia, were moving beyond anyone's control. The warning Jake issued was not born of malice, but of a profound desire to protect the very people who were too empathetic to protect themselves. He reportedly begged his parents to prioritize their own safety and to set firm limits on Nick's presence at the family property. Yet, in a heartbreaking testament to parental love, Rob and Michael never lost hope, even when their son's behavior began to scare them. For Jake, this was the ultimate tragedy. He had the professional tools to analyze the crisis and the personal courage to speak the truth. But he was powerless to change the hearts of the people who believed that love could conquer all. The night of December 13th, 2025, began with the glitter and warmth typical of a high-profile Hollywood holiday gathering. Comedian Conan O'Brien was hosting his annual Christmas party, an event where the industry's elite gathered to toast to another year of success. Among the guests were Rob Reiner and Michael Singer, accompanied by their son, Nick. But as the evening progressed, the festive atmosphere was punctured by a presence that several guests described as deeply unsettling. Nick Reiner, then 32, seemed out of place, dressed in a simple hoodie, while the rest of the room donned formal attire, more concerning than his clothing. However, was his demeanor. Witnesses described him as acting crazy, wandering through the crowd with a blank, emotionless stare and repeatedly interrupting conversations to ask guests if they were famous. The tension reached a visible peak when Nick reportedly interrupted a private conversation involving comedian Bill Hader. When Hader politely informed him that the discussion was private, Nick did not just walk away. He stood perfectly still, staring at Hader with an intensity that chilled those watching, before abruptly storming off. It was a public display of the volatility Jake had been warning about for months, a deterioration that was no longer confined to the private halls of the Brentwood estate. The situation finally boiled over into a very loud argument between Rob and Nick. Right there in the middle of the party, Rob, a man known for his booming voice and passionate advocacy, was seen chastising his son for his disruptive behavior. It was a rare public fracture in the Reiner family's shield of decency. Sources close to the family suggest that Rob was petrified, allegedly confessing to friends that same night that he was afraid his own son might hurt him. This was the horrifying realization of Jake's earlier warning. The unconditional hope had finally been eclipsed by a very real, very present fear. Exhausted and embarrassed, Rob and Michiel left the party earlier than planned. It is believed they returned to their Brentwood home, perhaps hoping that the quiet of the night would de-escalate the situation, as it often had in the past. But the music had already begun to stop. Within hours of that public blow-up, the decades of struggle, the 18 rehab stays, and the unheeded warnings would culminate in a final, silent tragedy. In the master bedroom of the home they had filled with love and activism, the couple who had tried everything met an end that no one, except perhaps their eldest son, could have truly seen coming. The aftermath of the events in Brentwood left a void that was both immediate and agonizingly loud. As the sun rose over Los Angeles on December 15th, the world began to grasp the magnitude of what had transpired within the walls of the Reiner estate. For Jake and his sister Romy, the discovery was not just a headline. It was the total collapse of their foundation. The house that had once been a sanctuary of creativity and family tradition was now a crime scene, sealed off by yellow tape that seemed to mock the decades of decency the family had stood for. The capture of Nick Reiner near the US campus brought a second, more complicated wave of trauma. Jake, who was in New York finishing work on a film when the news broke, flew back to a city that felt unrecognizable. The pain was immediate, a mixing of grief with a staggering sense of betrayal. He found himself anchored to his sister Romy, both of them trying to hold on to the remnants of a family that had been severed from within. In the days following the arrest, the public watched as the $4 million bail was set, a figure that, for a family of the Reiners' means, might have once seemed like a simple bridge back to some semblance of order. But for Jake, the reset he had hoped for was no longer possible. When Nick finally reached out from custody, his voice was frantic, desperate, and pleading. He did not just ask for emotional support. He asked for a lifeline in the form of bail money. It was in this moment that Jake faced the most agonizing decision of his life. He closed his eyes and heard the voice of the little boy he had spent his life protecting. But he also saw the faces of the two people who would never get another chance to be saved. Jake's refusal was not an act of revenge, but a final, tragic realization that the cycle of enabling had to end. "I can't use money to run from the truth," he told his brother, his voice carrying the weight of a stone. The decision was a public declaration that love, while powerful, cannot be used to erase an irreversible act. This stance froze the community in silence. It was a rare moment where a family member prioritized the weight of the crime over the ties of blood. By December 17th, when Jake sat in the Keeby's studio to deliver his report, he was no longer the polished reporter the audience knew. He was a son hollowed out by loss. His hands locked together so tightly his knuckles were pale. He spoke not just of the tragedy, but of the $4 million figure as a symbol of the unthinkable. He revealed that his refusal to support the bail was the last line he was forced to draw far too late, and at a cost that cut deeper than any career milestone or award. For Jake, the aftermath was not about legal strategy. It was about the crushing realization that sometimes the only way to honor those you have lost is to refuse to protect the one who took them away. The legacy of the Reiner family was always built on the idea that decency, laughter, and a committed heart could change the world. From the pioneering comedy of Carl Reiner to the passionate political activism and cinematic masterpieces of Rob Reiner, they represented the very best of the Hollywood dream. But as Jake Reiner stood amidst the ruins of that dream in early 2026, he offered the world a different kind of truth, one that was far more difficult to hear, but perhaps more necessary than any film his family ever produced. Jake's decision to speak openly about his unbelievable warning was never about seeking the spotlight he had spent a decade avoiding. It was a final, desperate act of journalistic integrity applied to his own bloodline. He chose to turn his personal agony into a lighthouse for other families drifting in the same dangerous waters of addiction and unaddressed mental health crises. His message was clear: love is a powerful force, but without boundaries and the courage to listen to the difficult warnings of those closest to us, it can sometimes become a shield for the very danger it seeks to heal. As the 2026 awards season began, the industry paused to honor the lives of Rob and Mitchell. At the Critics' Choice Awards, the tribute was not just for a director or a photographer. It was for a couple who had lived their lives with a boundless hope that eventually cost them everything. Jake and Romy watched from the shadows, carrying a wound that will never fully close, yet moving forward with a newfound clarity. Jake continues to act and report, but he does so now with the weight of a man who knows that some mistakes do not offer second chances, and some Christmases never come again. The story of the Reiner tragedy is a somber reminder that even in the most perfect families, there are silences that can become deafening. It teaches us that listening is just as important as loving, and that protecting someone sometimes means saying no when every part of your heart wants to say yes. Jake Reiner did not just lose his parents on that cold December night. He lost the innocence of believing that warnings are always enough. But in sharing his truth, he has ensured that his parents' legacy of decency lives on, not just in their films, but in the lives of those who hear his story and choose to set the boundaries that might just save a life. If this deep dive into the Reiner family's most difficult chapter has moved you, or if you have faced the complex challenge of balancing love with boundaries in your own life, we invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. We ask that you do so with the same respect and decency that Rob Reiner championed throughout his life. To stay connected with more deep, investigative stories about the people behind the headlines, Please subscribe to Memories of the Stars. Thank you for staying with us until the very end.